I'm Mark Phillips. I'm the Associate Dean of Digital Libraries at the University of North Texas, and that's in Denton, Texas, in the US. So I actually have been working in web archiving my entire career as a librarian. I started in 2002, and we really got started in web archiving at UNT in 2004. And so since then, I've been anywhere from working with the technology directly, doing crawls. Now I'm primarily an administrator and working on more of the policy and why do we collect what we collect. A lot of it was my previous boss, Kathy Hartman, was kind of a pioneer in both our digital library and in our web archiving activities. She started the Cyber Cemetery, and when I came to UNT, that was one of the projects I was really interested in working with, and got the opportunity to start working with her. And she was very successful in collaborating with institutions from around the United States and then internationally whenever we joined IIPC. And so I was just along for the ride for the longest time. And then as she's retired, a lot of the kind of strategy and maintaining the higher level relationships falls to me. And then we've got a small but great team at UNT that are doing work like with Lauren Coe, who's doing a lot on the technology and tools development work. So there's two of us that are primarily focused on web archiving, but unfortunately it's moved into marginal time for both of us. And so I'm only able to spend, never enough time on web archiving, and Lauren spends more, but still she's got a larger portfolio with the library. She manages our software development team, and she has other full-time folks that report up to through her. So we're marginally staffed there. We are starting to see more interest in web archiving from our collection, our special collections, and our other collecting areas within the library. So we're starting to see more interest, which is great. So slowly we're getting more marginal pieces of time getting added, but it would be great to have more resources. Our first content that we archived was the Cyber Cemetery. When we started that, that was 1997. So we don't say it too loudly, but we are one of the earliest. But I think with doing web archiving in what we would consider kind of a modern, archivally and preservation-focused process is really in 2004, when we started to use Heritrix and ARC files and then transitioned into WARC files. So before it was we got it how we got it. Sometimes it was delivered to us on hard drives. Sometimes it was captured with the previous versions of tools, which resulted in file system-based collections. But I think I always like to think about 2004 when we started to use Heritrix and the tools that IIPC had developed for doing a truly kind of preservation-worthy kind of collecting. Primarily, the Cyber Cemetery came out of the fact that we had a long-standing history as a federal depository library, as part of the depository library program of the government printing, now government publishing office. And it was the right time, right place, right set of connections that Kathy had. Government printing office was hosting websites, and they started to see these hosting contracts start to not be paid because agencies or commissions or committees would be defunded after they did their work. And so they contacted Kathy, who was very involved in electronic government information at that point, and still is, but said, do you have any ideas on what we should do with these? Are you interested in these? And so she said, yes, that it's an important thing for the citizens of the United States to have access to the websites that our government is producing to communicate with us. And once it's there, we need to be able to rely on that for both our democracy as a whole, but then also as we look at doing research with that in the future and understanding a time and place. The 90s were our government went online, and that's an important way. How they communicated with the citizens was a really important piece. And so it kind of started from there, and then has gone into a wider range of activities, from documenting our university publications and unt.edu, working with collaborators from across the country on our end-of-term web crawls that we do with them. And then now we're doing a lot more subject-based collection. We still have kind of that strong emphasis on the federal information. That's been something that we've felt has been the cornerstone of our collections, and is still of a strength we have and something we're looking forward. We have been collecting the unt.edu domain, so that's our university's web publishing domain, since 2004. We capture that twice a year, and that's part of just our mission as the university archives as well. And in addition to that, we're starting to see collections from our special collections being interested in kind of supplementing physical collections that they're acquiring and moving that into the digital realm. So LGBT collections, Dallas local collections, things that are important to the North Texas and Texas region. So we definitely do capture social media, and a lot of we do it in two ways. So one is kind of just passively, as it organically comes from doing web crawls, and we do seed our crawlers with the various social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram. We also do take special care to harvest video content from YouTube and from Vimeo. We also have some other activities that we do, which is adjacent to the web archiving piece, where we've proactively gathered some Twitter datasets using the Twitter API and making things that are of local or national importance to us. So we have like the Hurricane Harvey data set. We have probably about a dozen Twitter data sets that we make the identifiers available for that download. And then we started to get a lot of contact from researchers interested in actively using the larger data sets. So mostly it still is pretty manual in scope. The way that Lauren will do when we do our crawls. So we do a lot of our crawls locally. We run Heritrix directly. We will get the work files back. We'll load them into the Wayback Machine. We'll use Firefox in a proxy mode with the Open Wayback, and then we will record using some of the tools in Firefox whenever there are misses into the archive, and then we'll take those files, those URLs, and feed them back in and do kind of a patch crawl. So it's a pretty time-consuming, laborious process. It can take anywhere from an hour for a pretty quick site to many hours for larger scale sites. And it's something that we're really actively interested in automating further. And we've been involved in some of the IIPC initiatives to try to build some automated quality assurance tools and try to make them not only the methodologies, test those out, but then moving those into tools that all of us can start to rely on as part of our workflows. As new content is acquired, all of the things that we're acquiring locally in the digital library go through that process. And so this is nice because we're not like acquiring a huge amount. We're not doing large domain crawls all the time. Our biggest collecting happens every 4 years with our end of term crawling. And even that, there is a goal to try to do at least a high level quality assurance. There are patterns of things that go wrong. And so once you kind of start to see those, you can make sure that you get all the important CSS, getting all the important graphics, getting all of the important things from the websites. There are things that we know break, and so we can make sure we go through and try to identify those. But anytime we get new content in or are doing new crawls directly, we'll do a quality assurance piece before we truly finish up the crawls and then move those into the repository. Honestly, I think it's just kind of the professionalization of what we do. And when we started, when I started in 2004, I had no idea what I was doing. And so it was just like a Wild West in my mind. And as we just tried a bunch of things. We came across, we had already known about the Internet Archive, but we started to come across the tools that they were using. We were introduced to the ARC format. I think when we joined IIPC, then suddenly, we had a group of peers who were doing the same things. We could ask questions. We could be part of training. We could understand that there's a small suite of tools that we can use. And it really moved us from what was kind of a haphazard, we got what we got, to we can actually say what we're missing or we can measure this and talk about these collections in a more robust way. I think we're still a long ways from being able to communicate what we do and our collections to our users in a reasonable way. But I think at least within those of us that are doing the web archiving, we have a much better sense of like, this is how you do this. And the areas where we can also recognize where we're deficient. So we can say, we need to work on this. We need to plan to do this thing. So for us, it's we're still not doing well with full text search and even doing any more of the larger scale data extractions for reuse. Those are areas we know we can improve. I think generally knowing how the web works is important. And if the fundamental, just the basics, and you don't have to be a programmer that understands how handoffs between HTTP servers work, but knowing that there are protocols that we use and that here's how generally how messages are sent. You request things, you get responses back, and how these technologies work together. I think that's really important. Understanding the primary sources that provide information across the web, understanding how HTML works, understanding basically how JavaScript interacts with HTML, understanding how CSS interacts with both of those as well is important, especially when you start to run into problems with captures. And so it's a lot easier to explain like, okay, we didn't capture the JavaScript on this, or the CSS didn't come in, to explain why something doesn't look how it does. And then there's also, there are a lot of terminology that we use in the web archiving field that, like any profession, you have lingo or jargon, and we have that as well. And so being able to understand some of the basics, what is a seed, what are crawls, what is a job, what is an archive made up of archives, and so some of our language is kind of circular, but understanding these units that we talk about, what is scope, what are regular expressions, and I don't think that curators need to be Java developers who can run Heritrix on a Linux server, but knowing that asking for the entire Library of Congress domain every day to be harvested in completeness is not a realistic expectation for the tools. And knowing how you can kind of optimize like your request and the scope of your collecting to what's currently available with the tools and the infrastructure that you have is useful. It's not always possible, but it's helpful for communicating with the technologists and communicating with other collectors who are trying to do the same thing. All librarians should know that web archives exist and why web archives exist and what are we trying to accomplish on behalf of our colleagues, librarians who don't do web archiving. I think that all librarians should understand that we have a huge debt to pay to the Internet Archive for being kind of the web archive, but they're not the web archive. They're one of many web archives. And I think that that's an important thing, that just like there's not just one source of information, there are many sources, and in certain situations, there's better sources than the Internet Archive. So if you really want legislative content in the US, you might go to the Library of Congress for that. If you really wanted human rights content, you would go to the wonderful collections at Columbia. And it's like that for a lot of different things. If you really want to know about a single institution's collection, you should go to their web archive and work with that. And we as the field have tried to make discovering web archives much easier with some of the memento work that's happened and some of the aggregations that have happened. So I think that's what all librarians should know. And I think that for web archiving librarians, I do think it is helpful to know where kind of the trajectory of what we're trying to accomplish is where it's going. So what are our current challenges? What's really hard? What are we thinking about? And it's also then helpful to know what we're not thinking about, because it's still really hard. And so where can we be going as new people, as people get on the web more or on the internet more in different ways? Some of those interactions aren't being documented in the ways that we have become accustomed to with web archiving, and what's our role for that. So apps, mobile interactions, some of the really complicated interactions that are happening are really challenging to capture. And so just kind of knowing that those exist. I think we have an assumption that people know how to use web archives. And even when we in web archiving folks, we're really interested in these big computational uses of web archives. I think that most of our, and I speak from an academic institution, most of our grad students don't know how to use a web archive. They don't even know that they exist. They don't know how they could be used. Every single person has run into a 404. So everyone could be a web archive user, but I don't think most of our students even know that they exist. And so I think that's an area that librarians generally need to know more about. We need to be mentioning this in our instruction sessions. And especially when we're working in disciplines that have a web focus, it should be absolutely a component of that library instructions. We're very good instruction. We're really good about teaching databases that we pay for, but I think this is a core piece to the modern web is the fact that there are web archives. And so we need to make sure that that's understood. UNT would not be able to be where we are today without collaborations in web archiving, from the availability of tools that many people build together and make available through open source licenses to our various collecting projects that we've worked on. Our first big web archiving projects were collaborations through grant-funded projects from the Library of Congress, from the INDIP project. And that was with the California Digital Library, UNT, NYU. The ones that really stand out for me are the end of term projects that we've done. And this is a group that gets together every 4 years to document the kind of the transition between administrations, or during the period when a transition could occur. And so in the US, there's elections every 4 years at the executive branch. And we get together, it's participants like the Library of Congress, the Internet Archive are huge partners in this. And then over the years, we've had a consistent roster of others, including like Stanford University, the Government Publishing Office, Harvard has been involved, George Washington University. And so many have gotten involved, California Digital Library, to harvest, to identify what is the scope of the federal domain, which is odd that it's not easy to identify, to identify it, to collect it among all of the partners, and then to make that content available and preserved in our own repositories. And I think that we've learned a ton about not only how we communicate what we do, we've learned a lot on technology, transferring huge amounts of content, managing multiple crawls that feed into the same sort of like aggregated collection. This is where the archive of archives of archives kind of come in. So I think that's a big one. And then once we got involved with the IIPC, there have just been a number of other activities that we worked on through the various working groups, or trying to contribute to software development, trying to provide some kind of oversight and effort for the Open Wayback software package, and then just kind of being involved with our peers who are doing this kind of work. They can, so one of the tools that we actually built in collaboration with the End of Term project is what we call the URL nomination tool. And it's a way of setting up kind of a project, and we've had a number of these, the End of Terms. We've had some local events that have occurred where we're really interested in getting nomination of URLs, nomination of seeds from the community, and then we will go crawl those on behalf of that community. And this tool's been really helpful. There are other initiatives like Cobweb in the US that's trying to provide additional services on top of just basic nomination. But I think that's an important piece of running a web archive, is to make sure that it's unlikely that we will ever know the full scope of what we're trying to capture. And so having a mechanism where our users can provide access or provide suggestion on what we're missing is really helpful. Not really. That's been a gap that I think we have, where we do know it gets used. We get through kind of various feedback mechanisms, not only when people have problems, but we've had those stories that just make you feel good, where it's like, yes, you have this. You don't understand how important that this is. Oftentimes, it's actually federal agencies who are really happy that old versions of their websites still exist or were captured as part of the end of term. Or one agency is really happy that we captured parts of a committee in the cyber cemetery. So we do hear from that, but we have not done a good job of really understanding our users of the web archives. I think we have a much better sense of how users of our general digital libraries interact with our content, but the web archive specifically is something that's kind of a mystery, and we should do a better job at. I think data sets are one of the ways that we can kind of engage researchers in working with the tool or working with our collections. Just the way that web archives are created, they're not exactly like super user-oriented. The files as a whole, there's a lot to actually get into them. They're big. They're messy. It's hard to like really understand how to put things together. So I think extracting data sets that are much more like rectangular in scope that can fit into spreadsheets is usually helpful. They're really long spreadsheets, but at least they're things that people can work with. We've worked with creating some basic data sets for the end of term work, and that's making just even the CDX files available for others to do just a high-level analysis of where content's coming from, what was gathered. And then we've worked with making some Twitter data sets available, which is the API crawling of Twitter for various events. And then we're currently working on a research project that's going to have 3 data sets out of that, which are they're data sets from a web archive that have kind of categorized as so labeled data sets. A lot of the data sets that we can provide access are just like, reduced dumps of the data that's in our web archive. But some of these we're trying to actually label as, this would be useful in our collection or not useful in our collection, so that hopefully like some of the machine learning folks could get involved with our collections and help us identify content a little bit better. We're actually not that good at counting what we have. Depending on who you ask, we have very different sizes. So I think we're actually right around 200 and 250 terabytes of web content. About half of that is in our repository proper, and the rest of that is kind of, we have it, it's sitting around, but it hasn't been fully ingested into our systems. The bulk of that is going to be the end of term work that we've done. And then our UNT crawls are fairly large every semester that we do those. We actually do 2 different things. I'll talk about what I know the best. In the digital libraries, we actually run Heritrix 3 directly. We work with Open Wayback for playback. We are starting to use Web Recorder for certain kinds of capture when it's really challenging or if it's really small. And we've also used other tools. Anything that can write a WARC, we've probably used. And so we've used wget that writes to WARC. And we provide access through Wayback. We've started to experiment some with PyWayback. And we, as of right now, don't have a search solution. That's one of the areas that I know we really want to provide access, more services on. We also have an Archivist account where some of our subject selectors are doing more work with kind of extending their special collections content. But the things that we run locally in the digital library are more of these larger domain crawls or things that have specific parameters about how they're captured. We actually have a really great relationship with our library IT, which is not always common. They work really hard to provide us the kinds of solutions that we need. Sometimes it's challenging to explain the particular the specifics of how some of our software works, but especially when you're in a university environment trying to capture large portions of the federal domain, you're going to get calls from agencies every once in a while, and having people know about what you're doing at the IT level is absolutely needed, because they can, say it's something we know about and help us. And our IT actually does a really great job of letting all of the other kind of website owners in the university structure know that, like, hey, we're getting ready to do these annual crawls, and they help us communicate. And we're big users of our IT. They help provision storage for us for our repository infrastructure, provide servers. And so it's just constantly making sure that they know what we're doing, and we're also willing to let them try some things. So we've moved to virtualization of all of our crawlers. For the longest time, we had to have servers, bare servers, and they said, we really want to do these virtualized, and it's worked out really well. And so trying to understand both sides of things has been really important. The web archiving piece, I think, fits into, so we're a research library in, I forget our current designation because Carnegie just changed it, but what would be considered like an R1 institution. So where most of the library is really focused on more just-in-time acquisition of content instead of building we don't have a 100-year history of collecting everything like many of our peers do. We're a relatively recent R1 library. But there are areas where we should be collecting just in case. And I think the web is a specific one. If you don't collect it now, you can't go back in time and buy it. That being said, if you do collect things now and your acquisition process changes in the future, you can go back into your web archives and make collection decisions. Boy, I really wish we would have collected the PDFs from this website 5 years ago. If we captured that website, we can go acquire those PDFs now into our collections. So I think that there's a lot of proactive collection development that we can do with web archives. There's types of content that we would never get access to that we can get with web archives versus traditional means. We have a large LGBT collection in our special collections that is very much focused on the history of the LGBT community in Dallas. With web archiving, we can actually get the anti-LGBT community, which you'd never be able to acquire the physical collections of those and co-locate those with the physical collections. But in the web archiving sphere, you can get both sides of a topic, of a collection, and things that you wouldn't probably not be able to really get in-depth collections before. So I think it's one of the many tools we have in libraries to acquire content. I think that there are challenges in understanding how it can be provisioned for all situations. And I think some of them are really great use cases and it's really easy to explain. And then others, it's harder. It's not as precise. You can't say, I've got $50 or $5,000 and I want to buy so many books. I've got, a 3 terabyte budget and I don't have any idea how much that would be content-wise. So it's a tool that we don't understand all of the attributes of in the process, but it's really important for the future of libraries and for our researchers and our students and our faculty who are interested in using these collections. One of the things we're working on right now is because of the very technical specifics about the way that YouTube and Vimeo get crawled, it ends up being a really almost laughably poor user experience when a user gets to a web page that has a YouTube video on it, and they're almost never going to get to that content to play it back. And so we're working on some tools to help us connect YouTube players with the content that was actually captured through YouTube DL. And so connecting those is something that we're currently working on. I would like to have a much better, the next time I get asked how big is your collection, how many of this you have, I do want a better inventory of what we have. We've been collecting stuff. We have a rough count, but I'd really like to be able to have more specifics about the size and shape of our collections, not just gigabytes or terabytes and URLs, but what kinds of things? How many domains do we have? What's the scope of these collections? And then looking 5 years, I really want us to have full text search. like it's been way too long that we haven't. Our collections are large, but they're not unreasonable to do full text search for an institution like us now. It's just kind of balancing that marginal time that we have with our other the other things, because we have the whole digital library to worry about, and web archiving is an important but piece of that. So 5 years is to have a search interface that we're proud to show our users and say this is a way. And then I would really love to have some of our faculty who are really high users of our web archives. We have a few that have kind of dipped their toe into the web archive, but I'd really love to be able to have some really strong use cases for our faculty or our students using our web archives, so that it's no longer just in case. It's like, no, they're using them now. The main one we have, so like I said, we do a lot of local running of software, Open Wayback and Heritrix, but as we've started to get others in the library interested in working with web archives, there are kinds of web archiving that are more challenging to do manually. So if you want to crawl CNN every hour for the next week, it's really nice to have a service that can just automate that. And instead of, whereas like when we do large domain crawls, you can start them and then kind of monitor them and shut them down as needed. So we do use the archivist service for some of the more subject scoped collections, and our special collections folks are the primary users of that. We have a library-wide account, but our special collections are the biggest users, and they have access to it, and they add new seeds, and they do the crawls, and they manage that. And then we're responsible for then taking those work files and ingesting them in the repository as part of the library's collections. There aren't a huge amount of vendors that are out there, and depending on what country you're in or what region, there may be one or two that you can work with. I do think most of them do have kind of user groups that get together and talk about the work they do. Our main experiences was with Archivit, and they've been a great partner to work with. If we have questions, we ask. They have meetings for their users. They're really interested in trying out new things and working with partners on projects. But I think the one thing, and we're still not great about doing this, but the one thing to remember is that most of these harvesting tools or groups don't view themselves as preservation solutions. They are kind of a tool to get the content, maybe provide access to it, but I think it's still on us as institutions that use these services to bring that content locally and locally curate that, and maybe put up a local instance of Wayback or a local access point, so that we're not, we get upset in libraries about being locked into a vendor for some of our content, and we just need to make sure that we don't do it because of ourselves. They will always give you the content, you just have to actually get it. Part of it's just the scale. It can be really daunting, just knowing kind of what is out there that we could collect is kind of like, oh no. But from there, like once you start to think, okay, well, what are the scope of what we collect at my institution? Where can we actually use web archiving to make good collection decisions? I think it starts to come into something more tractable that you can deal with. We do run into challenges with the greater web archiving community we have some fairly complicated tools that have, in the greater scheme of things, a fairly small user base, and making sure that those tools are maintained, and not only just maintained, but move forward with the changes that we need to see them, is a challenge. And there just really are, there are dozens of people that are qualified to work on these in the world, which is a horrible thing to say about some like absolutely core infrastructure that we work with. And so like the Heritrix software package, the Open Wayback package is, they're important, and making sure that they still live up to the expectations we have for them, that they're still meeting our needs, and that they're moved forward not only in a maintenance capacity, but in a way that we can continue to rely on them to do what is a really important important activity in our libraries. The first large-scale web archive I didn't know about WARC files or ARC files. And so I had like 4 terabytes of just files littered across a file system and just no idea what to even start to do with them. And it's too bad because I couldn't really do anything with them in the future. Like they exist. And that's my first big, and that was 2004. We tried to do kind of an end of term crawl for the first Bush administration. And if I had started it about a month later, I probably would have like done my research enough, but like we had a time limit we had to start. And that's one of those like, oh, if I knew just a little bit more, I could have actually had, like, that's one of the great things about writing to standard formats. I didn't know what I was doing. If I'd written to WARCs or ARCs at that time, WARC wasn't around. If I'd written to ARC files, we could still use that. And that's cool. But I didn't know that, so I can't use it at all. And so it's super embarrassing, but it's like, I just didn't know. It was like about 3 weeks of research, and it was just, we used HT-track, and just like, I ran a dozen computers in our lab to try to get HT-track. Like we knew we wanted to do this, but just we didn't know how. And so then as we've learned, it's like kind of embarrassing to look back on, but you know, we tried.